The morning sun streamed through the gleaming windows of Premier Motors, catching the polished surfaces of luxury cars that dotted the showroom floor. It was just another Tuesday at Atlanta's most prestigious car dealership, where the air smelled of fresh leather and ambition. The sales team was gathered for their usual morning meeting, sipping coffee and discussing their targets, when the glass doors swung open. A woman in her late 50s walked in, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore simple jeans, a comfortable sweater, and well-worn sneakers, practical clothes for a day of running errands. Her warm brown eyes took in the impressive display of vehicles, a slight smile playing on her lips as she paused to admire a sleek silver Mercedes. One of the senior salesmen, a man who'd been with the dealership for 15 years, glanced up from his desk. He perfected what he called his customer assessment over the years, a quick once-over that he used to decide who was worth his time. His eyes flickered over the woman's casual attire, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He turned back to his computer screen, pretending to be deeply engrossed in something important. The woman didn't seem to notice. She moved through the showroom with quiet confidence, her fingertips trailing lightly over the hood of a midnight blue S-Class Mercedes. The price tag dangling from the mirror would have made most people's eyes water, but she studied it with genuine interest. A younger salesman started to approach her, but the senior salesman quickly intercepted. "I've got this one," he muttered under his breath, smoothing his designer tie. He'd seen this scenario play out countless times. People wandering in to daydream about cars they could never afford. Best to move them along quickly and focus on serious buyers. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone carrying just enough dismissiveness to make it clear he didn't expect to make a sale. His eyes were already scanning the entrance, hoping for a more promising customer to walk in. The woman turned to him with a gracious smile. "Yes, actually. I'm interested in this model," she said, gesturing to the Mercedes. "I'd love to know more about its features, particularly the safety systems. My son's been insisting I upgrade to something more modern." The salesman barely suppressed an eye roll. Of course, another tire kicker probably planning to report back to her imaginary rich son. He'd seen this routine before. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this particular vehicle is our premium model. The financing options are—" He paused deliberately, quite substantial. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at our pre-owned section. We'd have some nice compact cars that might better suit your needs." Several other customers in the showroom had stopped browsing to watch the interaction. A young saleswoman behind the front desk shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly embarrassed by her colleague's behavior. But the woman remained unruffled, reaching into her purse with the same calm demeanor she'd shown since walking in. "Actually," she said softly, pulling out her phone, "I think I'd better make a quick call first. My son mentioned he wanted to be here when I made my final choice." She dialed a number, turned slightly away from the salesman, and spoke quietly into the phone. The salesman crossed his arms, already planning how he'd escape this waste of time and get back to his real customers. Little did he know, the next 20 minutes would completely change his perspective on making assumptions about people, and teach him one of the most important lessons of his career. The tension in the showroom grew thicker as the senior salesman's behavior became more obviously inappropriate. When the woman asked about the Mercedes' advanced driver assistance features, he barely bothered to hide his impatience, speaking to her as if she were a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "Ma'am," he said with an exaggerated sigh, "this vehicle comes with technology that's quite complex." He emphasized the last word as if doubting her ability to understand. "The base price starts at $110,000, and with all the premium features, we're looking at closer to $140,000. He paused, watching her face for signs of shock or embarrassment. "That's before taxes and fees, of course." The woman nodded thoughtfully, seemingly unaffected by his tone. "I understand. Could you tell me more about the interior options?" I'm particularly interested in the premium leather package." The salesman let out a short, dismissive laugh that drew attention from nearby customers. A couple browsing a nearby SUV exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Look," he said, lowering his voice but not his condescension. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know when someone's actually in the market for a luxury vehicle." He gestured vaguely at her clothes. "Why don't we stop wasting each other's time? I can show you our certified pre-owned section, or there's a nice dealership down the street that specializes in more economical options." A young trainee who had been watching the interaction from behind a desk looked mortified. She started to stand up, perhaps to intervene, but the woman caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. The situation was about to change dramatically, though the arrogant salesman didn't know it yet. "I appreciate your concern," the woman replied calmly, her dignity intact despite his rudeness. "But I think I'll wait right here. My son should be arriving shortly." She pulled out her phone again, this time sending a quick text message. The salesman barely contained his eye roll. "Of course your son," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. "Well, while we're waiting for this mysterious son of yours, maybe you'd like some water. The coffee is for serious customers, but I'm sure we can find you something." Several people in the showroom had stopped pretending to look at cars and were now openly watching the scene unfold. The receptionist had turned bright red with embarrassment at her colleague's behavior. One elderly gentleman actually walked out in disgust, shaking his head as he passed the salesman. But the woman maintained her composure, standing tall despite the salesman's attempts to diminish her. She checked her watch and smiled slightly, as if she knew something no one else did. "He should be here any minute now," she said softly. The salesman made a show of checking his own watch. "Well, I have some actual customers coming in soon for a test drive. I can't really wait around all day for your—" He trailed off as the deep rumble of a powerful engine caught everyone's attention. Through the showroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see a stunning black Range Rover pulling up to the front of the dealership. The vehicle alone would have turned heads, but it was the driver stepping out that caused the entire showroom to fall silent. The salesman's face began to lose color as he watched a tall, athletic figure emerge from the SUV. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about him, the kind of familiar that comes from seeing someone's face on television, billboards, and sports magazines. The woman's small smile grew wider as she watched the showroom's reaction. The next few minutes were about to teach everyone present a valuable lesson about prejudice, respect, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Throughout the entire confrontation at the dealership, the woman's response to disrespect became a masterclass in grace under pressure. While the salesman continued his condescending behavior, she stood quietly, her posture relaxed but dignified, like someone who had weathered far worse storms than this. A young family browsing nearby had stopped pretending to look at cars and was now watching the scene unfold. The mother pulled her teenage daughter closer, whispering something in her ear. The daughter nodded, both of them clearly taking mental notes on how to handle difficult situations with such boys. The woman's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it briefly, her eyes crinkling with a knowing smile. The salesman, still hovering nearby, couldn't resist another jab. "I suppose that's your son saying he's too busy to come," he said with a smirk. "It happens all the time. People make up stories about wealthy relatives rather than just admitting they can't afford." Actually, the woman interrupted softly, for the first time cutting him off. "He's just pulled into the parking lot." Her voice remained calm, but there was a hint of something else in it now. Not triumph or smugness, but rather a quiet certainty that made several onlookers exchange glances. The receptionist, who had been squirming uncomfortably at her desk throughout the whole exchange, suddenly sat up straighter. Through the window, she could see the impressive black Range Rover that had just parked. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she quickly began straightening papers on her desk, trying to look busy. The woman used this moment to straighten her simple sweater, more out of habit than concern for appearance. A small gold pin on her collar caught the light, the kind of subtle detail the salesman had completely overlooked in his rush to judge her. It was the pin given to major hospital donors, though no one in the showroom would realize its significance just yet. "I should mention," she said, her voice still carrying that same gentle tone, "that my son can be a bit protective. He's worked very hard to get where he is, and he's seen me deal with situations like this before." She paused, meeting the salesman's increasingly uncertain gaze. "I've always taught him that the true measure of a person isn't how they handle respect, but how they handle disrespect." The showroom had fallen completely silent now. Even the usual ambient music seemed to have faded into the background. The salesman's confident demeanor had begun to crack, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Something about the way the other employees were acting, the receptionist's sudden business, the manager's emergence from his office, suggested that he had made a terrible mistake. Through the glass doors, they could see the tall figure from the Range Rover removing his sunglasses. The woman's phone buzzed one more time. "My son just made an interesting suggestion," she said, glancing at her screen. "He thinks instead of the silver Mercedes I was looking at, I might prefer the black one, the one in the VIP showroom." She looked up at the salesman. "I don't suppose you were planning to show me that one." The color drained from the salesman's face as realization began to dawn. The black Mercedes in the VIP showroom was their most expensive model, the one they used in their advertisements, often photographed with local celebrities and sports stars, including, as he was suddenly remembering, their city's famous point guard. The glass doors began to swing open, and the woman squared her shoulders, ready to greet her son. But before turning away from the salesman, she left him with one last gentle observation. "You know, in my 30 years as a surgeon, I learned that people are rarely exactly what they seem at first glance. Sometimes they're dealing with challenges you can't see. And sometimes," she smiled as heavy footsteps approached from behind her, "sometimes they're capable of surprising you in ways you never expected." The entrance of the tall figure into the showroom created the kind of silence usually reserved for movie moments. His presence was commanding, not just because of his impressive height or athletic build, but because of the quiet confidence he carried. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that spoke of success, but it was his warm smile, directed at his mother, that captured everyone's attention. The young family who had been watching earlier suddenly gasped in recognition. Their teenage daughter fumbled for her phone, then seemed to think better of it, watching the scene unfold instead. The father whispered something that sounded like, "That's him," from the playoffs last month. The basketball star moved with the fluid grace of an athlete, but there was nothing showy about his entrance. His focus was entirely on his mother, his face lighting up as he approached her. The salesman, who had been practically glued to her side moments ago, now seemed to be looking for the quickest escape route. "Mom," the basketball player called out, his voice carrying easily across the showroom. He wrapped her in a warm embrace, lifting her slightly off her feet. She laughed, the sound bright and genuine, as he set her down carefully. "Sorry I'm a little late. Traffic on 5th was terrible." The other customers in the showroom had given up any pretense of car shopping. Some had their phones out, recording discreetly, while others simply stared. The dealership's manager had appeared from his office, adjusting his tie nervously as he approached. The basketball star kept one arm protectively around his mother's shoulders as he turned to face the salesman. The contrast between them was striking. The salesman in his now rumpled suit seemed to have shrunk several inches, while the athlete's presence seemed to fill the space. "I hear you've been helping my mother look at cars," he said, his voice pleasant, but with an edge of steel beneath it. His eyes flicked to the salesman's name tag, then back to his face. The salesman opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. A large poster on the wall behind them suddenly caught everyone's attention. It showed the same basketball player, mid-jump shot, wearing their city's team colors. The dealership had been using his image to sell cars for the past year, something the salesman would have known if he bothered to look up from his prejudices long enough to recognize his customer. The silver Mercedes she was looking at is nice, the basketball player continued, glancing at the car in question. But I think Mom deserves something special. He looked down at his mother with obvious pride. Did you tell him about your retirement party last week? About how the hospital named the new pediatric wing after you? The receptionist's gasp was audible in the quiet showroom. Now everyone could see the small gold pin on the woman's sweater, the one given to major hospital donors and distinguished medical staff. The same pin that was prominently displayed in the hospital's Hall of Fame, alongside her picture and credentials as their former chief of surgery. No, his mother replied softly, her eyes twinkling. We didn't quite get to that part of the conversation. The manager had finally reached them, practically tripping over himself in his haste. Doctor, he began, recognizing her now with growing horror. We are so honored to have you here. Please, let me personally show you our VIP showroom. We have several exclusive models I'm sure would interest you. The basketball player raised his hand politely, stopping the manager mid-sentence. Actually, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the showroom, I think we'd like to hear what your salesman here was about to suggest. He seemed to have some very strong opinions about what kind of car my mother should be looking at. The silence that followed was deafening. The salesman's face had gone from pale to ashen, as the full weight of his actions, and their consequences, began to sink in. The revelation hit the showroom like a gentle earthquake, sending ripples of realization through everyone present. The basketball star stood tall beside his mother, but it was her quiet dignity that commanded the most attention. She stepped forward, addressing the now trembling salesman with the same calm she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. I think now might be a good time for proper introductions, she said, her voice carrying easily in the hushed showroom. I'm Doctor, she paused, letting her title sink in, former chief of surgery at Emory University Hospital. She gestured to her son, though it was hardly necessary. His face was literally on the wall behind them. And this is my son, starting point guard for our city's team. The young family who had been watching earlier had inched closer, their teenage daughter clutching her father's arm in excitement. The mother was nodding with fierce approval at the scene unfolding before them. The receptionist had given up any pretense of work, watching with wide eyes as history was being made in their showroom. That jersey, the doctor continued, pointing to a framed basketball jersey hanging prominently near the entrance. The one the salesman had walked past countless times that day, belongs to my son. The same son I mentioned when I first walked in. Her words weren't angry, just matter of fact, which somehow made them even more powerful. The manager stepped forward again, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Doctor, please accept our deepest apologies. The behavior you experienced today is completely unacceptable and does not reflect our dealership's values. He shot a withering look at the salesman, who seemed to be trying to disappear into his shoes. The basketball star raised his hand again, his expression serious but not unkind. You know what's interesting? He said, addressing the room at large. My mom could have pulled out her hospital ID right away. She could have mentioned my name, or shown you her financial statements. He shook his head slowly. But she shouldn't have to prove herself worthy of respect. None of us should. The salesman finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I don't know what to say. I made assumptions, terrible assumptions. Yes, you did, the doctor agreed quietly. The same assumptions I've faced throughout my career. The same ones my son has fought against his whole life. The kind that make people look at a woman in casual clothes and decide she doesn't belong in a luxury car showroom. A small crowd had gathered outside the dealership's windows, people pressing their faces against the glass to see the famous basketball player. But inside, all attention was on his mother, who stood with the poise of someone used to teaching important lessons in difficult moments. The irony is, she continued, I was planning to buy 2 cars today. One for myself, and one as a donation to the hospital's annual charity auction. She smiled slightly. I suppose I'll need to find another dealership for that. The manager looked like he might faint. The potential loss of not just 1 but 2 luxury car sales, not to mention the publicity nightmare that could follow, was clearly hitting him hard. But the doctor wasn't finished speaking. However, she said, glancing at her son, who nodded in agreement, I believe in teaching moments. And this, she gestured around the silent showroom, could be one of those moments. Sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't anger, it's education. The salesman looked up, tears visible in his eyes. The doctor's words seemed to be hitting him harder than any angry outburst could have. Around them, the other customers and staff members were hanging on every word, witnessing a masterclass in handling discrimination with grace and turning it into an opportunity for change. The basketball star took a step forward, his presence commanding but not threatening. The way he carried himself showed years of handling both victory and adversity with equal grace, a trait clearly learned from his mother. He looked directly at the salesman, who was still struggling to maintain eye contact. Let me tell you a story, he began, his deep voice gentle. When I was 10 years old, my mom and I went to buy my first basketball shoes. We'd saved up for months. The store clerk took one look at us and tried to direct us to the clearance section. He paused, letting the parallel sink in. Mom was already a successful surgeon then, but she was dressed in scrubs after a long shift. The young family who had been watching had drawn even closer, their teenage daughter recording every word on her phone. The father had tears in his eyes, nodding in recognition of a story that felt all too familiar. You know what my mom did? The basketball star continued, glancing at his mother with deep respect. She didn't get angry. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she turned it into a lesson, not just for the clerk, but for me too. She taught me that how we respond to disrespect shapes who we become. The salesman's shoulders slumped further with each word. The doctor placed a gentle hand on her son's arm, and he stepped back, letting her take center stage again. Around them, the showroom remained silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something profound. In the operating room, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, we don't have the luxury of judging people by their appearance, their clothes, or their bank accounts. Every life is precious, every person valuable. She looked around the showroom, making eye contact with each person present. The same should be true everywhere else. The manager started to speak, probably to offer another apology, but the basketball star held up his hand again. I'm not finished, he said firmly. See, my mom didn't just teach me about handling discrimination. She taught me about forgiveness too, about how sometimes people's mistakes could become chances for growth. He turned to address the other customers in the showroom, particularly the young family. When I made it to the NBA, reporters always asked about my training routine, my diet, my coaches. But they rarely asked about the most important factor in my success, the lessons my mom taught me about dignity, perseverance, and treating everyone with respect. The salesman, who had been staring at the floor, finally looked up. His face showed genuine remorse, not just embarrassment at being caught. Your mother, he said quietly, she handled my behavior with more grace than I deserved. No, the doctor corrected gently, I handled it with exactly as much grace as every human being deserves. That's the point we're trying to make. The basketball star nodded, then addressed the salesman directly. You know what's hanging in my locker at the arena? A photo of my mom in her surgical scrubs, right after completing a 12-hour operation that saved a child's life. That's who you dismissed today, not because of who she is, but because of what you assumed she wasn't. The silence in the showroom was profound. Even the crowd outside the windows had grown quiet, sensing the importance of the moment. The doctor's simple sweater and jeans now seemed to carry a different kind of dignity. Not because of her son's fame or her own accomplishments, but because of how she'd handled this situation with such remarkable grace. So, the basketball star concluded, "What happens next is up to you." He wasn't just speaking to the salesman anymore, but to everyone present. Every interaction we have is a chance to either build walls or break them down. Today, we're giving you the opportunity to choose which one you want to do. The dealership owner, who had been called from a meeting upstairs, burst through the office doors and quickly assessed the situation. Within seconds, his face shifted from confusion to recognition to horror as his staff quietly filled him in on what had transpired. Here was one of the city's most respected doctors and mother of their dealership's most famous sponsor, standing in his showroom after being treated disgracefully. "Please," the owner said, his voice shaking slightly as he approached the doctor and her son. "Would you step into my office? I want to personally address this situation." His eyes darted nervously between them and the growing crowd outside the showroom windows, some of whom were recording with their phones. The doctor exchanged a look with her son before responding. "Actually," she said thoughtfully, "I think this conversation needs to happen right here." She gestured to the gathered customers and staff. "Everyone in this room has witnessed something today, and they should also witness how we choose to handle it." The young family who had been watching nodded in agreement. Their teenage daughter, who had been recording everything, whispered to her mother, "This should be shown in every school." The owner wiped his forehead with a handkerchief and turned to the salesman. "Pack your things," he said firmly. "Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately." "Wait," the doctor's voice cut through the tension. "Is that really the best solution?" She looked around the showroom thoughtfully. "Firing him might make everyone feel better for a moment, but what does it actually solve? He'll just take his biases to another workplace." Her son stepped forward, sharing a knowing look with his mother. "Mom's right," he said. "Sometimes the harder path is the better one." He turned to the owner. "Instead of firing him, why not make this a turning point? Not just for him, but for the entire dealership." The owner looked confused but interested. "What do you suggest?" The doctor smoothed her simple sweater, a gesture that now seemed to carry new meaning to everyone watching. "Your dealership has an opportunity here. Instead of just removing one person, you could address the root of the problem." She paused, making sure her words carried weight. "When I was chief of surgery, we didn't just remove problematic staff. We implemented systemic changes to prevent issues from happening in the first place." A murmur of agreement rippled through the showroom. The receptionist, who had been taking notes, nodded enthusiastically. "I have connections at the university's Diversity and Inclusion Department," the doctor continued. "They offer excellent training programs. Instead of firing your salesman, why not make him part of implementing a comprehensive training program for all staff members?" The basketball star smiled proudly at his mother's suggestion. "And I'd be happy to come speak at the first session," he added. "Share some real-world experiences about how unconscious bias affects people every day." The owner's eyes widened at the opportunity being presented. Instead of a PR nightmare, they were being offered a chance to become a leader in changing industry culture. The salesman, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up. His voice was thick with emotion. "I don't deserve this chance," he said quietly. "But if you're willing to give it to me, I promise I'll make it count." "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow," the doctor replied. "That's something else I've learned after 30 years in medicine. Sometimes the patients who seem the most difficult turn out to be the ones who teach us the most." The owner straightened his tie, seemed to come to a decision. "Doctor," he said firmly, "your wisdom and grace are humbling. Would you consider joining our board of advisors? Help us create a training program that could be a model for other dealerships." The young family's daughter, still recording, spoke up unexpectedly. "This is better than any basketball game," she said, causing a ripple of gentle laughter through the showroom. "This is real change happening right in front of us." In the weeks that followed the showroom incident, the dealership underwent a remarkable transformation. The story of what happened that day spread quickly through social media, thanks partly to the young girl's video. But it wasn't the confrontation that went viral, it was the resolution. The doctor's suggestion for comprehensive training became reality faster than anyone expected. The university's diversity department helped create a program specifically tailored for customer service environments. The first session was held in the dealership's largest conference room, with every employee present, from the cleaning staff to the owner himself. I remember being nervous that first day. The former salesman shared with a local reporter who came to cover the story. He sat in his newly assigned position, diversity and inclusion coordinator for the dealership. But when the doctor walked in, wearing those same comfortable clothes, she smiled at me like she truly believed in my ability to change. The basketball star kept his promise too. He arrived at the training session in his team jersey, but he wasn't there to talk about sports. Instead, he shared personal stories, times when he and his mother had faced prejudice, moments when assumptions had created barriers, and how they'd chosen to respond with dignity rather than anger. "My mom always says that anger breaks things down," he told the gathered staff, "but education builds things up. That's what we're doing here, building something new." The impact rippled beyond the dealership. Other car dealers in the city began reaching out, asking about the training program. The owner, seeing an opportunity to lead by example, made all their materials freely available. "We're not looking to profit from this," he explained during a business leadership conference. "We're looking to create real change in our industry." The young family who witnessed the original incident became regular volunteers at the dealership's new community outreach programs. Their teenage daughter, inspired by the doctor's grace under pressure, started a social awareness club at her high school. "When I grow up," she told her parents, "I'd want to handle difficult situations just like that doctor did." The receptionist, who had watched everything unfold that day, took on additional responsibilities organizing the training sessions. "It's amazing," she said during a staff meeting, "how one moment of potential conflict turned into such a positive change for everyone." But perhaps the most profound transformation was in the former salesman himself. He threw himself into his new role with genuine commitment. Each morning, before the dealership opened, he would walk the showroom floor, remembering that day and the lessons it taught him. "I keep a photo on my desk now," he shared during one of the training sessions he helped facilitate. "It's not of cars or sales awards. It's a simple picture of that empty showroom. It reminds me that every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, regardless of what they're wearing or how they look." The doctor continued her involvement too, but in her characteristically modest way. She joined the dealership's advisory board, offering gentle guidance and wisdom drawn from her years of breaking barriers in medicine. Her son often joked that she spent more time at the dealership now than he did, despite being their star sponsor. The beautiful thing, the owner reflected during a local business awards ceremony where the dealership was being honored for its diversity initiatives, is that we learned success isn't just about selling cars. It's about building relationships, challenging assumptions, and creating an environment where everyone feels valued. The training program evolved to include regular community feedback sessions, where customers from all walks of life were invited to share their experiences. The dealership's sales actually increased, not because they were selling more cars, but because they were building a reputation for genuine respect and inclusivity. Sometimes, the doctor told a group of business students who came to study the dealership's transformation, "The most powerful changes come from our most uncomfortable moments. The key is being willing to learn from them rather than hide from them." 1 year after the incident that changed everything, the dealership hosted a special anniversary event. The showroom, once the scene of discrimination, had been transformed into a gathering space filled with people from all walks of life. Photos along the walls told the story of their journey, not just the famous incident, but all the positive changes that followed. The former salesman, now standing confidently in his role as diversity coordinator, greeted visitors at the door. His transformation wasn't just professional. There was a genuine warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Every morning, he told a group of new employees, "I remember that day and think about how one moment of prejudice became the wake-up call that changed my life. The doctor arrived wearing another simple sweater, looking exactly as she had that first day. But this time, every person in the showroom knew exactly who she was, not because of her title or her son's fame, but because of the impact she'd had on their community. The real victory, she said during her speech at the anniversary event, isn't that one person learned a lesson. It's that an entire community chose to grow from it. She gestured to the crowd, which included car dealers from across the state who had come to learn about implementing similar programs. Change is like a pebble in a pond. The ripples keep spreading long after the initial splash. Her basketball star son stood proudly beside her, still in his team jersey after coming straight from practice. "Mom," he said, taking the microphone, "remember when you used to tell me that championships aren't just won on the court?" This past year proved that true change isn't just about one moment of confrontation. It's about the commitment to keep growing afterward. The young family who witnessed the original incident was there too. Their daughter, now president of her school's social awareness club, had brought 20 of her classmates. They sat cross-legged on the showroom floor, listening intently as the doctor shared stories about breaking barriers in medicine and life. The dealership's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Sales had doubled, not because they'd become better at selling cars, but because they'd become better at connecting with people. Their customer base now reflected the true diversity of their city, and their hiring practices had evolved to do the same. "We don't just sell cars anymore," the owner explained to a Business Journal reporter covering the event. "We build bridges. Every person who walks through our doors knows they'll be treated with respect, not because of what they're wearing or driving, but because that's who we've become as a community." The former salesman's eyes welled up as he shared his part of the story. "The doctor could have ended my career that day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Instead, she saw an opportunity to create lasting change. She taught me that true transformation isn't about punishment, it's about growth. As the evening drew to a close, the doctor and her son walked through the showroom one last time. They paused by the silver Mercedes she had originally come to look at, now displayed with a plaque telling their story. "You know," she said to her son, smiling, "I never did buy that car." "No," he laughed, "but you bought something much more valuable. You bought into the possibility that people can change. And look what happened because of that belief." The final photo added to the wall that evening showed the entire dealership staff, standing together with the doctor and her son. But it wasn't their fame that made the photo special. It was the genuine smiles, the clear bond between people who had learned to see past their differences and find common ground. This story, the doctor concluded in her final remarks, isn't just about one day in a car showroom. It's about what happens when we choose to transform moments of prejudice into opportunities for growth. It's about the power each of us has to create change, not through force or shame, but through patience, understanding, and the unwavering belief in people's capacity to learn and grow.